Good afternoon, everyone. Hope everyone is doing well. Really excited again today for this week's Building Power Grassroots Education Advocacy. I am your host, Zakiya Sankara-Jabar, and today I am so pleased to bring my brother and friend, Dr. Arash Daneshzadeh. I hope I didn't screw his name
No,
up. We
you
talked
didn't. That was
about
perfect.
this.
Thank you.
Uh, Certainly someone I have a lot of respect for. We have been communicating, I think, online and different, work around the school to prison pipeline, my time at Dignity in Schools campaign. Arash will talk a little bit about his work with Save the Kids, who's a member. And so we've just been in connection for several years, and he has done some incredible work, particularly around the school to prison pipeline and around education, K through 12 education. And he is also a professor in the Bay Area. So I am going to take some time here to tell you a little bit more about our guest and read his bio for you. So Dr. Arash Daneshzadeh was born in Tehran, Iran, and raised in the San Francisco Bay Area as a biracial refugee and formerly incarcerated youth, where he has served the mission of education equity for 16 years. Dr. Daneshzadeh started his career in East Palo Alto and Oakland, California, teaching high school math and civics for students transitioning from the carceral spaces within juvenile justice back into mainstream education. Arash also serves as the national chair of the Save the Kids from Incarceration, which is a national nonprofit focused on prison abolition and school-sanctioned violence, co-edited a textbook on the topic of youth punishment, unentitled Understanding, Dismantling, and Disrupting the School to Prison Pipeline, or the prison to school pipeline.
Right.
Sorry about that. For
No,
the past 4 years, Dr. Daneshzadeh has taught classes on campus climate and culture and the intersection of hip hop and critical race theory in the Graduate School of Education at the University of San Francisco. For the past 7 years, Dr. Daneshzadeh has taught math in the Prison University Project at San Quentin State Penitentiary, which he credits as one of the most rewarding experiences of his life. Dr. Daneshzadeh's doctoral research at UC Davis involved an ethnographic study on Black girls participating in restorative justice programs at a local alternative school in San Francisco, which focuses on navigational capital among Black girls who are often forgotten and individualized by education systems. Since 2017, Arash has facilitated programs for the Story for All, a local nonprofit that coaches educational practitioners on culturally responsive teaching and art-infused oral history methodology. He is a founding team member of an own public school in Arizona called Phoenix International Academy, whose pedagogical model is grounded on the project-based learning and restorative practices. Currently, Dr. Daneshzadeh serves as the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Transformative Justice. Wow, man, that's a heck of a career for someone, as you stated in the earlier part of your bio here, formerly incarcerated youth. Please tell us, I guess, it may be, makes sense to other people since you were formerly incarcerated, but if for folks who like to know a little bit more about your passion, right? Tell us a little bit more about why you're so passionate about these issues around education equity.
Sure. First of all, thank you, Zakiya, and all the folks behind the scenes who are doing the good work and coordinating really necessary conversations like this in these precarious times. So I really appreciate this. Thank you for reading that entire bio. I think I would be remiss if I didn't add, I've been alive for a long time, so I had a lot of time on my hands. But going back to your question, which is a fair point, it's always important to know sort of the impetus behind why we do what we do. And I think that, one of the first things you write when you start to write a dissertation is a positionality paper, which is what about your position, your identity, and your proverbial journey allowed you to get to this point where this is the research that you want to spend the rest of your life doing. This is the activism. So a few things. I am formerly incarcerated a couple times when I was in high school, actually. Both involved me sort of standing up to law enforcement during an opportunity where, kind of like what Dr. Joy DeGruy talks about, is using our non-Black person of color privilege to get in the way between the communities we care for and the harm that's being done. And I found myself in a bind. But in terms of like how I got into the actual nitty gritty of sort of the Black girls, ethnographic research, testimonial, storytelling work, hip hop methodology, I think it's sort of a hodgepodge of just my own interests, the communities that allowed me to acculturate to a U.S. Colony that I'm a part of now, and sort of my own background. And so I started off as a teacher and in the San Francisco Unified before I went to Oakland and came back to San Francisco as a professor. And I had, I worked in the school. My first school that I worked at, Black students were 9% of the population, and there were 78% of our suspensions. And I noticed that every time one of my
Did you say 9%, but 78% of the?
Yeah.
Wow.
When I was growing up in the Mission District, before it was cool for white people to go jogging at night, and Teslas moved in, the population was not that. It was about double that in terms of Black and brown folks. Brown folks a lot higher, but in terms of just like people who were any part of the African diaspora, it was at least in the double digits when I was a kid. And it's gotten steadily denuded as the port industry in Oakland and San Francisco has gotten more automated. And so a lot of those service worker jobs that worked in the ports, that were portsmen in Oakland and San Francisco, a lot of my friends' parents, my play aunties and uncles, they all got pushed out because we have machines and cranes now to do that work. And so, folks started moving in, especially with the tech boom. And so there was an inextricable link between hyper policing in schools and what was happening with the housing situation in our communities.
Talk about that.
And as
That's incredible. A lot of people don't make that link.
Absolutely. And you and I have talked about this online before together. Like, zip code is such a proxy, not only for the quality of education in terms of access to a multidisciplinary, liberal, humanities-focused education, what we call a well-rounded education in the conventional sense, but also in terms of quality of life that our kids deal with. And so I worked, I stopped teaching about 6-7 years ago at the high school level, and I've been working in higher education since as a dean and as a professor. And I just 6-7 years ago, I noticed that, the staggering disciplinary rates were as communities were getting pushed out, the policing was getting pushed in schools. And so this idea that schools are this bastion of protection and uplifting youth, I think is a fabrication of the fact that they have a permeable membrane of what's happening right outside their walls. And so when I see arrest rates going up for Black folks, despite the fact that their numbers in our schools are going down, then there's something a little bit more intentional happening beneath the surface. And so you can't talk about school-sanctioned violence, police violence. You can't talk about abolition work if you're not talking about the nutrition gap, you're not talking about a housing gap, you're not talking about a food scarcity gap, right? There isn't an achievement gap. There's a lack of resources that allows our people to learn in a way that's conducive to a healthy lifestyle. And the dirty truth of it is, and not to get too morose about it, but it's important that we call this out, is that even with the Williams Act, which is a national act that came around the civil rights movement, that required every school in the United States to have equitable, and this is post Brown versus Board, have equitable number of textbooks, locker rooms, not having dilapidated buildings in comparison to predominantly white schools, et cetera. That's not the case, Zakiya. So why is that the case? Because we have victim blend and gaslighted communities at every turn and every opportunity to tell students, in the same way that in my book, How Whiteness Stole Justice tries to really embolden, we are putting the onus of intergenerational violence on, let's see, what's high school, 13 to 18-year-olds, right? In 2020, we're still blaming them for stuff that's been going on since 1619. So housing is a huge part of that, right? There's a reason why predominantly Black people still live in Deep East, and as they move into other communities, they have at least a certain nominal amount of formal education to be able to afford certain communities. That's by design. I mean, there's a reason why in Daly City in South San Francisco, that's where the majority of my Hmong, Laotian, Vietnamese, Cambodian, Southeast Asian folks, when they were building the railroads in California and these buildings that these Fortune 500 companies and tech firms have moved into, they were told they could only live in these communities. It wasn't like we all got together and said, hey, as refugees, Brett, like where are we about to live? Like, and this had a glaring impact on schooling. And so that's how we decided where SROs were going to be. And they worked in parallel and they worked symbiotically. So I hope that sort of captured it in the most succinct way.
I mean, that was a lot. And I feel like, San Francisco particularly gets a lot of positive kind of media, if in terms of it's a, people see it as a very progressive place. Of course, it's so close to, Silicon Valley. But when we talk about education, and particularly, education for Black students and for Brown students, hearing what you just said around the structural kind of inequities that literally pushed out Black folks, from San Francisco, that's a different narrative than the mainstream narrative that those of us who don't live in the Bay Area, don't have any history or connection than we normally hear. Of course, I'm connected to groups there. Coleman Advocates, which is based in San Francisco, does a lot of great work. Of course,
that's my folks.
Across the Bay, Black Organizing Project, and all these other folks. A Black Education Network, which is based out in San Jose. So there's a bunch of different folks, who've been doing this work and organizing, that I feel like I want you to talk a little bit more about this T-shirt you got on, because I feel like that's connected to everything that we're talking about, right? Like, let's just unpack, like, tell us about this T-shirt and how is it connected to the work that you do?
So this is some of my swag. I make swag and I use it to pay for some of the work that we do in SaveTheKidsGroup.org, which is my group that's made of penal abolitionists as well as formerly incarcerated adults who are now educators and activists. So we have our own gear. This is a line that I made. And yeah, to your point, Zakiya, I'm not one for subtlety. So, but when we think about housing and policing and schools, we have to think about whiteness as more than just a construct of not only skin color and colorism, albeit those are absolutely issues that we could have another session about. But the fact that there's an economic structure incentivizing bad behavior in our schools. And that is absolutely linked to this larger macro level idea of what whiteness is, right? We were just talking about the election and who and what is deemed most qualified to run against Donald Trump. And all I'll say, without getting too incendiary or polemic about this, is I want us to start as people of color and historically colonized and, quite frankly, historically looted people, the first people, to really think about what it is that we want out of the idea of achievement. Because if we want our students to simply integrate, like Dr. King said, into a burning house, we're doing just fine. The number of students of color that enter my class at a historically white Jesuit school has gone up like 200% every year since I've been there.
Wow.
So like, it's not an issue of like getting into these spaces. It's an issue of how much of our values do we have to denude? How much of our identity and our positionality do we have to shear off like sheep in order to get to that position? right? And I'm not, I know I'm not the first one to say this. There's plenty of Black queer feminists, you know, Queen Toure to Nick Ruma to Salafi. There's plenty of people I can point to that I can tell you are my academic North Stars and my mentors. And, you know, my mom, who's North African, you know, she was part of one of the first Black Panther Party chapters that she wrote for about the mistreatment of Bear folks who are the Afro North Africans who are descendants of Moors in North Africa. And she was expatriated to Iran where she met my dad. And this idea of like finding interracial solidarity is not just about being an ally. It's about the fact that we have a common enemy. And until we can organize into this idea of not playing oppression Olympics and really thinking about the fact that, okay, we can push all the Black people out of San Francisco, but there's still a hierarchy, and it's actually gotten worse. We're just doing it to Latinx people now. We're just doing it to Southeast Asian people now. So if we can't,
but the Black people were first.
Yeah, Black people were absolutely first, and they usually are in terms of who's going to feel it first, right? Outside of our indigenous folks. So I think that's sort of where my impulse came from at the end of the day. You know, I can tell you a lot of stories, and I know you and I have talked about this as well, Mine, about students we've lost to the system, not only in terms of getting incarcerated, but I've had, unfortunately, in my 16 years, I've been to 11 funerals. Of
oh my goodness, of students, of your students, 11 funerals.
11 funerals.
That is so tragic.
Doesn't include the ones that I've missed because I just, for whatever reason, I just had one recently. One of my former students, who, you know, just 2 weeks ago, two of my former students were shot by police. So thinking about how this isn't something that schools can always protect our students from because they are just as complicit. When we think about an education system that's rooted in industrial schools that literally stalked and kidnapped to convert what we called conversion industrial schools, Oklahoma, Carlisle schools, prime example, right? These schools are flush across the country. They just operate by different semantics. And so this idea that, you know, but our suspension rates are going up. Progress is happening. Well, again, this is what I mean by, what do we mean by progress and achievement? Because there's a lot of schools, and you and I know you know this because of the work I know Dignity in Schools did when you were there, but like, there's schools that are cooking their books. Like,
oh, absolutely. They're definitely cooking the books on the numbers. No, I mean, so one of the things that we found, and this is like working with actual parents and actual folks who are being directly impacted, right? Parents were getting calls saying, you know, just come and pick up your child for the rest of the day, and then, you know, they'll do a half a day tomorrow. Completely illegal stuff. There's paperwork involved in suspensions. There's an entire process. You're supposed to have a conference with the parent. None of that stuff was happening, right? And so when you talk about cooking the books, that's exactly what was happening. So a part of the organizing strategy for a lot of the groups around the country, especially those who work directly with parents and young people, was that, you know, like really like educating them on school policy and practice. And like, actually the school isn't supposed to be doing that. They literally can't do that, right? And so that's something that, and I'm so glad you brought that up, because I feel like this is a good segue to some of the research that you've done. And we talked about it in your bio, and you and I talked about it a little bit last week when we had our check-in, is that you have been really digging deep and looking at how Black girls navigate schools, right? That's something that's critically important to me. As a mom, I actually got into this work when my son was impacted, but I also am a mom of a daughter who would have been a rising first grader, but our school district is all virtual. And so we have unenrolled her and will be looking to do a kind of a micro school or pod experience for her, just because virtual is just not going to work for a first grader, for at least for her. And so one of the things that I want you to talk about is share about your experience with working with these young Black girls. Talk a little bit about some of your research findings. I think we have like some pictures and graphs or something that we can even share with the audience, because that's something that's very important to me. And I think that we should be centering the experiences of Black girls.
Absolutely. So the Shot Foundation did some research that focuses predominantly on the impact of school-sanctioned violence on Black youth. And I wrote in the first chapter of my book that I'm currently completing, called How Whiteness Stole Justice. Hopefully it'll be published by next November. That's the goal, according to my publisher. But the idea is that, look, we know that the school to prison pipeline, this idea that there is a level of racialized enclosures happening in our schools that are disproportionately impacting our students of color, particularly our Black students, is I would say almost irrefutable and as objective as you can be when you just look at numbers. For example, since 2010 to 2016, they found that the number of Black girls who have been suspended since prior to 2010 went up 640%. Right? This is also research that you can find on the Civil Rights Department of the Department of Education website too. There's also graphs that demonstrate that. And if I find it, I could probably share it with you. So I have it somewhere on my laptop. I'll send it later. But so we have these narratives, and the other thing is that a lot of the solutions that we're putting into dismantling this pipeline, although for 2/3 of our students of color, school is prison. So this idea of school to prison, I feel like, is a misnomer. And Damian Sojourner at UCLA, Michael Dumas at Cal, Pedro Noguera at USC. I mean, there's plenty of people who I know talk about this. So again, I always like to give a shout out to my elders who I know doing this work as well. But this idea that we can just like somehow neuter or like de-gender the very gendered impact of Black boys being framed as savages, Black girls being over-sexualized and villainized, Black hair in general being policed. The nonprofit that I worked at during my doctoral research when I was a grad student at Davis, I had to tell my executive director not to take the do-rag off of one of my students' heads while he was sitting for our presentation, because in front of all of our other colleagues, he told the kid that he was unprofessional and he'll never go to college that way. The kid had on a suit. He just had a bad hair day, according to him, wanted to wear a do-rag. So there's time and place and there's decorum, absolutely. But this idea that there's this unmitigated entitlement that we feel over Black bodies.
Over Black bodies and policing of our expression of our Black bodies is something that I see happening to Black boys and girls. You know, we see stories, the national stories that are happening. One popular one, unfortunately, last year was a young man who had locks. This was a private school. We also see this especially a lot in private schools. Remember that? And they actually prohibited the young man from actually walking, from like
Wasn't he
literally
like valedictorian?
Valedictorian. I mean, it was nuts, right?
Yeah.
And so this idea, because it's also a part of some, unfortunately, internalized oppression on the part of some people of color and African and Black people as well, is because we'll see some of these kind of same policies in some higher education institutions, including, unfortunately, some HBCUs. I know Hampton University in Virginia was called out several years ago for having some of these kind of like anti, Black hairstyle kind of, especially around locks and what professionalism is, and having a very Eurocentric view around what professionalism is. And so I think that's something that's critical. We see it from K through 12 all the way throughout the business world. It's really unfortunate. Thankfully, though, I will point out a bright light is that I have been reading lately that the military is evolving, at least around hairstyles and locks and things like that, and relaxing some of the kind of requirements that were initially around in the military and around military service. I think I've seen some briefs come out from the Army and I believe even the Marine Corps adjusting their policies and practices around how Black people can manage and wear their hair. So that's one bright spot.
Absolutely. And that's why I think also as as someone who ascribes to a lot of Black feminist thought and a lot of like newer sort of more evolved offshoots like Afro-pessimism and other things, this idea that we need to create laws that are proximal to whiteness, that tell us you can't do something, tells me that our very idea of integration was already a farce to begin with.
Come on, right? Come on.
And
talk about it.
So when we think about what we want our students to get out of education, it can't just be a stepladder into a White House. Otherwise, we might as well ask for we might as well implant the chip ourselves and ask to be remote control. So I think
this idea of that's deep. No, you got to say that again. No, I'm serious, because that's real. That is so real. Yeah. Like this idea of being so controlled by a society who wants to police expression, right? That's just, I don't think there is a full kind of really in-depth understanding about how that interaction happens literally at every facet of life. I know that as a young child, we're socialized. This is the way that you act. Like you got to do this. I grew up in the South, and we still use language like, you make sure you don't be acting like that around them white folks, kind of thing. Like, like this, how I'm serious, what I mean? Be careful when you go here. Yeah.
Code switching is for sure a thing. I mean, people have made entire careers, people who shall not be named have made entire careers about literally writing about code switching. I mean, Du Bois got on the map with double consciousness, RIP. So when we think about what it means to have a diverse society, we cannot talk about what we want in terms of integration and diversity and representation without talking about dynamics of power. Because if we're only talking about identity in terms of the optical illusion of diversity, then we're not having conversations around the stories that we can tell about how many times just Zakiya has been pulled up, right? So that's why, as a non-Black person of color who is cishet, who doesn't identify and hasn't identified as a woman or in any way purport to know what the experiences of Black girls and young Black women are, I thought that it would be important to do an ethnographic study in which young Black girls could actually tell their own story.
Yes.
And this school that I actually did my research on, that my book is based on, and the work that we do at Save the Kids from Incarceration, was at a school where the principal, who's a dear friend of mine, a wonderful woman, and she grew up in the community that the kids are coming from. So I appreciated that about her. I chose her site because she had me do a training with her teachers last summer around project-based restorative justice models, which is what we call in a lot of us restorative justice researchers, we call it a tier 1 model. So this idea of it starts from the top and everything kind of flushes down with this idea of like restorative justice, which quite frankly is just this idea that we are all stakeholders, that school is not a transaction, as Freire talks about, that school is a bilateral thing, right? It's something that we are all complicit and also culpable to if we have the power to make change, right? However, we cannot blame students for what we call emotional lack of emotional regulation, things like grit and growth mindset, if we can't talk about the elephant in the room, which is the fact that my colleagues who have 2 master's degrees and multiple PhDs can't even have a civil conversation about white supremacy without losing their emotional regulation.
Thank you.
Why are we putting that on a bunch of 15-year-old kids?
Come on, talk about it. Yeah.
So this idea that restorative justice has been co-opted, appropriated, and quite frankly, put through a prism of white feminism, which to me has become redundant. That, okay, let's say 2 kids get into a fight in the hallway, right? And I already am that school that has a 78% suspension rate of Black youth. And these 2 students happen to be Black or identify as Black. I tell these students they can't come back to this classroom and learn, and in some cases even have access to a warm meal at lunchtime because they're in a rubber room or in the principal's office getting mediated and learning how to regulate their emotions, rather than thinking
Right.
about the intergenerational trauma, epigenetics,
That's right.
housing, hunger, the fact that many of our students, our SAT scores at one high school that I worked with in the school district went up as soon as the students had access to eye reading glasses. You know, so
Wow. Something as simple as that, right?
something as simple as
Simple
that,
as that.
Zakiya. Something as simple as that. So I'm saying when we have at least hard evidence that gives us a nominal amount of evidence that points to something other than a student's pathology, why do we put everything on someone's pathology when there's an entire environment that has sort of fanned the flame? Sort of like, I would say what happened to our brothers and sisters in Lebanon is a
Oh,
great
yeah.
encapsulation, right? We put all of this liquid nitrogen and all these combustible volatile fuels in a community that's grounded predominantly by service workers and port people in Beirut, and then it blows up, and the
Right.
response looks nothing like the response America gave to France when the Notre Dame Cathedral burned down.
Right.
Right? So
Right.
why is it that we're and so this disproportionate amount of systemic violence gets sort of swept under the rug behind the auspice of a hyper individualized focus on a child's behavior,
Right.
and not thinking about the crux of that behavior. And I teach a class called Critical Hip Hop Studies at USF, and it's
Oh, now I know my audience want to hear about that. Let me just say really quickly,
sorry if I'm going on too
folks.
many
This is wonderful. Look, this is how we do on Building Power, because we
Right.
want to give tools and strategies, and we also want to, like you said, share theories and ideas with the audience that they can either attach on to and say, hey, I want to follow up. This is something that I think may work in my community. We have a very access to a wide audience across the United States. So one of the things that I wanted to offer now just to the audience is, if you have any questions, right, for Dr. Arash, make sure that you post them in the comments, because in a few minutes here, we'll get to audience questions so we can have some interactive conversation. But I think this idea around hip hop pedagogy has really, I want to say, maybe within the last 5 years has taken off. Can you, first of all, give a definition of
Sure.
what that is, and also tell the audience why it's so important, particularly for our kids and the kids we're trying to reach?
So let me give a shameless plug. So I'm a co-editor with Dr. Ahmad Washington, who's a friend of mine from the University of Louisville, who does a lot of work
Yes, I know
on,
that brother too.
on counseling and Black boys. And Dr. Anthony Nocello, who's another dear friend, which I know you know as well, with Save the Kids, because Chelsea, I think, made the introduction. So the three of us actually edited a book that's coming out in a couple months called Hip Hop Activism, which is an anthology of interviews that the three of us did with MCs, educators, Black folks in the communities that we serve, around like how hip hop is grounded in subversive education, this idea of radical subversion. And this idea of radicalism, Angela Davis talked about, going at the root versus sort of the way radicalism has been seen as this radical left, polemic, sort of anarchist spin. And I think that sometimes a little bit of anarchy is necessary for people to understand what's wrong.
Hey, that's right.
And let me explain what I mean by that, because I say that to my undergrads at USF, and they start freaking out. They're like, "Is Dr. D going to have us like take some Molotov cocktails to the school?"
Hilarious.
Like,
Maybe. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
Let me explain what I actually mean. Interesting how the NBA didn't even get a bubble until some pre-approved hashtags were allowed on jerseys. And that's not even, I haven't seen Black Power on any of these jerseys. It's interesting how the word thug has turned into a pejorative when Hillary Clinton was calling Black boys with hoodies super predators and thugs just in the last election. So I want us to really think about the fact that words can get co-opted from their original meaning without us doing the genealogical history and surveying, and quite frankly, storytelling from our communities, which is why I chose to speak to Black girls, because we assume everything that works for Black and brown boys is going to work for Black girls. We forget that gender and just like sexuality is fluid. We forget that instruments that may work on a few students cannot necessarily be made scale. And so in my critical hip hop studies class, it's essentially using hip hop as a vehicle to deliver the message of critical race theory, Afro-pessimism, critical race theory, Black feminist thought, which are just 3 of the 13 theories that I talk about throughout the course of my semester, through hip hop. So a couple of the topics we talk about that I think are related to what we're talking about, Zakiya, is, so we'll talk about Bill Clinton's Transcontinental Communications Act of 1997. Why is it artists like Immortal Technique, Lupe Fiasco, Rhapsody, Queen Latifah, Brother Ali, rappers that historically and MCs that historically have talked about
Dead Prez,
that we have, Dead Prez, I know we can keep going. Dead Prez, Public Enemy, the fear of a Black planet, it really was not just a term, you know what I mean? So
that's right. That's right.
So why is it that the same 25 songs get played on the radio? That's the first question I asked on the
That's
first
critical media studies too. Are you familiar with the work with Dr. Jared Ball out of Morgan State?
Hey, Jared Ball is one of the people we interviewed for our book, so thank you.
Yes.
Jared's the homie. Jared is actually a reviewer for the Transformative Justice Journal, so I sent him a lot of articles that I want him to review. So yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Jared is someone I look up to. I loved his book. So that he played off of Steve Biko's book. But anyway, so we talk about that. And the first question I asked on the first day of class to my students in September is, and I'm going to ask them this semester, is why do you hear the same 25 songs on the radio? Is it because Drake is just that good? Or is it because there's certain messages that become dangerous when they become incentivized?
Oh, come on,
And that conversation goes back to why the smaller radio stations, i.e. small businesses that Congress purports to care about so much, don't get the same level of access in terms of network and quite frankly, net worth, when, not because they're a smaller studio, when certain songs are not played. And so this idea—
Can you say the act again? Because I don't think a lot of people are familiar with that.
The Transcontinental Telecommunications Act of 1997 was an act that was endorsed by Democratic President Bill Clinton. And it was basically, and I actually have a long thread on Twitter that I can, I'll share with you in DMs and you can share it widely as well. But I wrote a long thread about it the other day because I was just like, I don't think people understand, like, yeah, I'll listen to some Drake, I'll listen to some, Jacob, whatever, but like, no name, shout out. But there's a reason why other artists who, like, Let's Get Free is one of my favorite albums of all time. I have not heard a single song on Let's Get Free on KMEL or 94.9 or, so why is that? So I did some research and I found that hip hop has a double-edged sword, right? There is absolutely a double consciousness to hip hop. I think an artist that has been able to slightly break free to both sides, like a Lupe or a Rhapsody, are rare, and they should not be, right? And so much of hip hop has forced to become more lyrical and poetic, not just because there are axioms that we want to deliver to our people in an artistic way. Absolutely, there's a creativity behind it. But I think part of the bent is being able to subvert, but also having access to those mainstream networks without literally saying, I'm a Marxist, Black feminist who wants to get rid of the capitalism to the degree that there are no social contracts in our society, right? I can't just say that on a song. So instead, I might say something like Elzai said in Detroit State of Mind, where he said, perhaps public school is a glass house the devil throws stones through. Or even something as simple as Inspector Deck saying life as a shorty shouldn't be so rough. So then we start thinking about, well, what should life as a youth or a shorty be like, right? And so this coded language is part and parcel to what academics have been doing for years through their research. Academics are not unbiased. right? We have positions, we have journeys.
Of course.
Absolutely.
Academic, listen, I talk about this all the time. I said, oftentimes people have this idea that the most progressive ideas come from the academy. And there's an argument to be made that white supremacy is refined in the academy. It's more sophisticated from the academy, and that people have to be very careful about the information that they're wholly co-signing if they don't have a grounding in historical oppression. That's the thing that I think that is critical, to this conversation. But in terms of hip hop, like I said, this thing has been growing. My partner, my husband, is totally on board with hip hop education and how to use it as a pedagogical practice to reach students in all areas, right? Tyson Amir is a brother who's also
a friend.
So he's out in the Bay, and he has his Black Boy curriculum. We've had him on. In fact, I'm going to actually bring him on one-to-one, but he's been on virtual town halls with us. And so, this is something that we know as a community, as Black folks and other people of color, we know what works. And so to me, I feel like this is a good segue for us to start talking about solutions, right? We're in the middle of a pandemic, right? This is, like everything else, disproportionately impacting, even in death, Black folks and other people of color. In terms of education, it's going to be, people need to get away from this idea that we're going back to school as it was before. Schooling is going to be different. I think we need to just say that now. Like right now, I live in a community, where most of the schools in Maryland will be virtual only, right? These decisions have largely been made without the input of poor and working class families, particularly poor and working class Black families and other families of color, right? When you look at the data, particularly in the Black community, Black women are the CEOs of the household, right? Most of our children are growing up in single-headed households, and that's not a derogatory statement, it's just a fact. And so how are we supporting families in this place where virtual, if I have to work outside of the house, 9 times out of 10, Black women are also essential workers, and other women of color in a lot of, as our CEO talks about, in feminized jobs, grocery store workers, restaurant workers, direct care workers, all of these different things coming in contact with this. Where are they going to get time to oversee virtual learning, number one? How are their kids going to be educated? We have not, as a country, centered this experience. And I wanted to talk to you based on, just your own expertise. Have you and other colleagues been thinking about this, right? How can we really use this as an opportunity to evolve education in the way that it really needed to be from jump?
Yeah, no,
I know
absolutely.
that's a loaded question.
No, there's several things that came to mind. One, I would love to speak to your husband, and if there's a way for he and I to synergize, like, please, I would love the introduction. I know I follow him, but I would love to talk to him further. But yeah, like, when Pac said Doug Live, people just took that on the surface and didn't realize that it was an acronym for the hate you give little infants F's everybody. It was basically Bronfenbrenner's theory of ecological systems theory through slang. And he was basically saying that every Black youth that you treat as a disposable body or commodified labor source is going to have rewards, but it's also going to come back and the chickens are going to come home to roost. And that's what's happening. You can't expect to displace the people who nanny your children, mow your lawns, cook your food, take care of your house chores, raise your kids, teach your kids, clean your schools, and act like if they can't live in your community, it's all good. No, bro, it's not all good. So thinking about how this violence has a circuitous poetry to it is critical. So going back to my research, so I looked at a school, and I've looked at several alternative schools throughout the country. I've worked in schools in Chicago with Karen Lewis, and Wisconsin and Madison, and doing some consulting work right now in New York as well. But thinking about how the schools that are actually taking on a project-based restorative justice model, what that looks like, I'll say a little bit. because I think, the research, the dissertation, the books that we're writing have way more, and I think I would be understating it. But basically, teachers are trained by me and other restorative justice abolitionists the last few summers on how to do a restorative model of education that allows students to treat systemic harm in their communities without feeling like they're getting off topic in terms of the curriculum. So what does that actually look like? Which is something I'm sure your viewers are wondering. So I know we talked about this on the phone last week, but Elaine Brown, former Panther, very prominent figurehead in activist work from the Bay to really, quite frankly, everywhere. And she worked with a lot of formerly incarcerated folks, including many of my former students from San Quentin State Penitentiary, who can work with youth when they got out. And there we have urban gardens throughout the mission, okay? And so one of the projects that the last school that I was teaching at in the mission took on was an urban gardening program that could be led by mentors who are former Panthers, Panther Cubs, formerly incarcerated folks, to do urban gardening and then take that produce, sell it back to their communities at a lower cost. So we're feeding our people healthy, nutritious foods, and also be able to teach the kids how to financially manage their money. So you're getting financial literacy.
That's building power.
You're getting basically Black Wall Street again without the Wall Street component. You're getting people who are self-sufficient without the oligarchy, right?
That's right. Which is necessary.
Which is necessary. And when I was doing this RJ training for this school with Dr. Brown and other people who were leading this urban gardening program at this particular high school I was at, it was about 5-6 years ago. It was on the heels of what we had heard about at Flint, Michigan. And so a lot of the students were like, Mr. D, I want to sell this stuff to my community, but with the toxic lead runoff from a lot of the industries and tech companies that have moved in, how do I know that this soil, this water supply is even clean? And so that's when we started bringing in STEM. That's when we were bringing in our AP and honors chemistry instructors and saying, hey, teach our kids, if they were in Flint, Michigan, how would they measure the toxic lead runoff in the soil? And so they worked with our ethnic studies coaches. They worked with our AP chemistry teachers, and the students ended up doing a presentation to Mayor Ed Lee, who's our former mayor of San Francisco before London Breed, and who passed away several years ago. We invited him to the school. They did a presentation. They found that the soil is in fact has been soiled, for lack of a better term. And he actually donated 2 weeks later forklifts of free and clean topsoil from Orchard to our kids, right? Why is it that this school had to, almost like pulling teeth, do all this research to tell the mayor something that they should have been known, right? And the reason is because these communities are treated as disposable. Yeah, you're self-sufficient, but almost to the degree where it's like, if you get sick, you get sick, right? And so to me, that's real restorative justice. We're not just thinking about restoring the harm between two Black youth that get into a fight in the hallway and saying, you're angry because you're just an angry child, your parents don't value education, your culture is prone to violence. But really thinking about the systemic violence of things like what's happening in Flint, what's happening in Baltimore, what's happening in Detroit, right? What's happening in Oakland.
In DC.
It's
environmental racism.
Environmental racism. There's a reason why in Richmond, the level of ovarian cancer, lung disease, heart disease has gone up since Chevron moved in there 60 years ago, right? Black folks have a higher cancer rate since Chevron moved in. Is that a coincidence? Or can we actually apply some critical thinking skills to this?
That's right.
Right. So what I found was what happened with that garden with Dr. Brown and the urban planning folks and that multidisciplinary approach to education where you had chemistry teachers teaching about measuring the topsoil right after the week after the ethnic studies teacher was teaching the kids about how the lead got into the soil in the first place. So the kids got to learn about the link between gentrification and housing and urban gardening, urban planning, the fact that things like cul-de-sacs have always been little bubbles to hyper police streets against Black middle class folks, like things like that, that even
Wow.
like my
I
own
didn't even
mother,
know that. Tell me a
even
little bit more
my mother
about
was,
that. The
yeah.
idea of cul-de-sac. How does a cul-de-sac police Black middle class folks?
So there are things like what do they call HOAs and things like that were heavily racialized back in the day. And
Oh yeah.
cul-de-sacs were some of the first to have policing as a part of the HOA. Like we're paying for our own private police force. So I'm sort of the like pre-Zimmerman, George Zimmerman's. And those were, not to say cul-de-sacs were like designed for that, but they were absolutely exploited for that. And I would say that when we think about the fact that in 2016, Wells Fargo lost a $70 billion lawsuit because they were not giving equitable mortgage loans to Black families that had the same credit score as some of their white counterparts that were getting approved for certain mortgage loans. Why? Because Wells Fargo, even in the 2000s, was intentionally saying, she better not move to my street. They better not be able to afford this house, right? You're not saying that. So this idea that like racism is acutely tethered
It's
to
anti-Blackness.
using,
That's specifically
yeah,
anti-Blackness. Yeah.
right. I don't
That's
need
an
to wear,
example of anti-Blackness.
right.
Yeah.
I don't need to wear a Klan hood and say the N-word to make you feel like an N-word.
That's right.
Like the idea that like I can still be anti-Black, clean up my language for TV, have some pink and green on my car and stomp it out, don't mean that I care about Black folks. It means that I know how to perform, right?
Ooh.
So
Ooh. Wow. Wow.
do I want to hype up AKA because I want all the Black women to vote for me, or do I actually want to think about policies and practice that I have been culpable to that have put my fellow Black folks in jail for about 30 years? So having conversations around like the anti-Trump response to racism in schools is great and necessary, right? Because we have an immediate harm, we need harm reduction. But if we cannot start thinking beyond this idea of I'm trying to just get in where I fit in, then we're going to be in for a rude awakening when we are basically like shuffling the deck of the Titanic and the ship is still sinking. Right?
Wow.
I'm glad that we all got out the basement. I'm glad that we're on the deck. But guess what? We're not all getting life rafts. We're not
We're
all
not
going to get
all
off.
getting life rafts.
Who's getting off first? That's the question I want to really think about. So
right. So in terms of, and we have about 8 minutes left, this has been so great, so fulfilling. I know the comment section has been blowing up. I don't know if we have any questions yet, but folks got 8 more minutes to get in any kind of questions for folks, for Dr. Arash here. And one of the things that I'm thinking about in these last couple of minutes, if we can, I love to like focus on solutions, right? I know that we can talk ad nauseum about the problem. And I don't want to assume everybody knows what the problem, because you've highlighted about 3 things here that I wasn't even aware of in terms of the bill that Bill Clinton signed into law that is certainly influencing what we hear on the radio, to this idea of cul-de-sacs and HOAs. I knew HOAs were racialized. I did know that, but I didn't know that cul-de-sacs specifically had been exploited for that purpose. In terms of solutions and moving forward in this COVID-19 moment and pandemic, do you have any, just off the cuff ideas of how families, particularly poor and working class families, who are already at the margins pre-COVID, how we can continue to educate our children and families outside of the binary that we're currently offered, whether it's in-person school and kids are going to be forced to wear a mask all day like they're doing in Ohio, or all virtual like they're doing in LA and other parts of the country. Where is the nuance, and where can we really be innovative and creative in this moment?
Sure. I would say there's 2 longer things that I've sort of been brainstorming about since our conversation last week, as I mentioned prior to this call. And one short answer that I'll give. And I'll start with the short answer, and that is this idea of knowing our rights and knowing our power. This idea that like, just because I have a doctoral degree means that I'm somehow better equipped to fight this fight is not true. right? Marcus Garvey organized 6 million Black people without Twitter. So I don't know how we can.
Come on.
So
we're celebrating his 133rd
right.
birthday, August 17th, and there was an RBG conference last weekend that celebrated the centennial of his organization. So,
and we are as well through Save the Kids with our Black August organizing movements throughout the country. Because Save the Kids from Incarceration, we have national chapters, and we're doing the same thing. So I'm glad that we're here with it. The two longer answers, and I'm longer relative. The first is, ever since COVID hit, I think that political pundits have been trying their best. Some of whom have been trying their best to pit service workers such as teachers, because that's what teachers are. They're servants. They're public servants, and parents and families. This idea that like you're getting a job, you're one of the people who hasn't lost your job, you need to go back, and really thinking about, if we don't value and uplift the health and safety of the people who are educating our children, then what makes us think that even if our kids go to school and they don't, God forbid, they're not inoculated by COVID, that somehow what's happening to teachers is being disposable, is somehow going to like evade students. Like, if we don't even teach our teachers, we don't pay our teachers enough to live a healthy lifestyle, why do you think we're paying them enough to go die, right? And so the solution is really thinking more about how to organize around not only educational safety, but alongside educational practitioners. Because I think many of the concerns that teachers have are no different than parents. I mean, many of our teachers are parents, but are no different than our parents and our students. However, they have a platform. And I think that as soon as you start,
they have a union, powerful unions in some places.
But I really want teachers and parents to start throwing out facts around how the economic structure that white people have put up in our communities around schools it will cease to exist if they force in-person schooling too quickly. So what do I mean by that? You get about 30% of the funding, at least in California, for your schools up until like the first certain number of days that every pupil is in class. I can't remember the exact number, and that law keeps changing every like 10 years. But when I first started at least teaching 20 years ago, I don't want to carve and date myself, but after a certain number of days, the school then gets the full amount for that pupil, right? So if you can force someone basically to put their butt in a chair for a certain number of months, you're good. So after a certain number of time, there's a reason why in the spring, suspensions go up. It's not because Black kids don't act right in the spring. It's because after a certain amount of time, the school says, I got my money, boo-boo, bye-bye. You don't need to be here anymore. So essentially, they're cash coffers. We're treating these Black kids as cash coffers. And once we can get our teachers and parents to co-sign this economic model of, hey, your school isn't going to exist if you force this too quickly, because not only will the teachers get sick, but if a student isn't there long enough, you're not going to get full funding. All of this is going to go by the wayside, right? And the other piece, which I think is part and parcel to my research around restorative justice and the work I did with Black girls last year, is allowing students to tell their own story, right? Allowing them to have space to facilitate. I'm so tired of hearing, some of my teacher ed candidates who I love, but they come into the classroom and I ask them, why do you want to be a teacher? Because I teach in our teacher credential program. And they say, because I want to give voices to the voiceless, as if there's somehow empty repositories that I give a microphone to. I said, no, if you haven't listened to hip hop, students have voices.
Amen.
It's that they're unheard and largely criminalized voices.
Exactly.
So how can we move beyond hearing, but actually follow through and responding? And so restorative justice ain't just about, I hear you, I'm sorry you feel that way, gaslighting. But really, this is what I'm going to do and change in my behavior and my policies and my practices as a school, as a principal, as a teacher, as a superintendent, to ensure that this violence doesn't happen again. And so how we get there is giving them hard evidence. One of my favorite quotes from my dissertation research was one of the Black girls, Kendall, and that's her pseudonym, not her real name, because I didn't want to use their real names. She said, it's really cute how she was like, Dr. D, I really like how your white students at USF get to learn about anti-Blackness from infographics and charts. I get to learn about infographics by being alive.
Wow.
And I
Wow.
just like, I swear to you, Zakiya, she said that to me last November, and I just sit with that quote from Kendall like every day. I think about that quote. Not a day has gone by I've not thought about that. Like, that's how I feel about being a refugee. This cognitive dissonance of living in a country that is responsible for making me a refugee. Now
That's
imagine how 30 million Black people must feel.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
So I think
this has been great, Dr. Daneshzadeh. I so appreciate you and just want to just affirm the amazing work that you have been doing in community, not for Black and brown folks, but in community, in relationship, in trusted relationship with Black folks all across the country. I wanted to share these two questions that came in. You can certainly hop on the thread later, and from our Citizen Ed link, we shared it here in the chat for you if you want to get on. But the first question came in, and they wanted you to kind of expound on this, and you can do this in the comments. It says, please expound on how you're using hip hop pedagogy to actually improve student outcomes. That's a wonderful question, because I think that at the end of the day, we certainly want to see progress and better student outcomes and achievement for our babies, right? The other question was, how can we improve the curriculum overall so our children learn life while being educated? I think that's also a critical, like, what's the actual practical application of what children are actually learning in schools? Like I said, the chat was off the chain. Please go back and look at some of the comments. We had, really engaged audience. This has been great. Like I said, at some point, we're certainly going to bring you back on, because I think as we continue to, as education right now continues to evolve, we're going to continue to have to meet the moment. I'm doing my best as well as a parent and organizer to continue to center the folks who are not currently being centered in this conversation on evolving education. So this has been your guest this week with Building Power and Grassroots Education Advocacy with Dr. Daneshzadeh over at the University of San Francisco out in the Bay Area. Next week, we're actually going to have our sister Kalila Harris, Dr. Kalila Harris, who is the managing director of the education department over at Center for American Progress. Our sister has been doing really good work. She was also the assistant director of the African American Excellence Department and in the Obama administration. So we're gonna be really having a good conversation with her about COVID-19 and how education is evolving and how we can be really meeting the moment for young people and parents. So thank you so much for joining us this week. This has been great, and I will see you for my audience. I'll see you all next week, same time, same place. Join us.